Welcome back! If you're just joining the series, you may consider watching the setup video so you're ready to keep coding and learning. In this video, we will learn about ARIA attributes, testing with Voiceover, using Inspector to view the accessibility tree, and to check and improve color contrast. Check the video description for a link to an article with the video transcript and code samples from this lesson. You may want to refer back to the first lesson that explored web accessibility, Episode 7. To begin this lesson, open our project in VS Code. If you are just joining us, you can download the starter project to catch up. See the link in the video description. In the terminal, type the start command, npm run start, to run the project. In the first lesson on accessibility, we talked about the impact of hierarchy, content, contrast, and keyboard interaction. Now that you've begun learning CSS, we can revisit a few of those topics to layer in styling considerations. Open index.html in VS Code and organize your screen to be split with the browser, like we've done in the last few lessons. We're going to update this page to be an About Me style page. So first, let's work on the hierarchy of the page content. One update before we dive into that is to update the title tag in the head to be more meaningful than website. Let's use all about and fill in your name. Next, update the H1 to the same as the title. At this point, we do not have a need to list headings 2 through 6, since we are adding more realistic content. For now, let's remove headings 3 through 6 and update the H2 to your job title or a fun descriptor. Before we get too far, it would be good to add some more meaningful container tags. So let's wrap the H1 with a header tag, and then wrap the rest of the content with the main tag. Then wrap the H2, P, and A tag content with the article tag. As a quick reminder, there should only be one main tag per page, and it should wrap whatever is intended as the true main content that supports the purpose of the page. An article tag is used around any content that is able to stand alone. Now we'll use a new tag to update the divs we had in place before, which is aside. The aside tag is used for content that is indirectly related to the rest of the content, or to call out some information. To help decide if the aside element is appropriate, consider if the content makes sense away from the rest of the page content. Save, and thanks to the classes we created in our previous lesson, there has been no change in appearance. While we're here, you can decide whether to remove the container -- raised class from the second aside or to add it to the first one. Now's the opportunity to make them the same, just for visual consistency. You could also add the margin -- top class to the first aside. Let's quickly update the content in the asides. For each, let's change the H2 to an H3. Then change the content of the first one to hobbies and interests, and the second to favorite books or favorite songs, or whatever topic you have a ranking preference for. You can then fill in the list with items relevant to you. Now, a little detour on this topic to adjust the space inside our container class. So open up the style.css file, and in the container class rule, add padding 16 pixels, and save. Whew, that feels better not to have the heading stuck in the corner. Okay, back to accessibility. Let's test out our page so far using Voiceover. On a Mac, the VO keys are Control plus Option. And with those pressed, I can also press the U key to open the heading menu. This looks okay, but let's choose the H2 and see our focus moves there. Then press the VO keys plus the right arrow key to move forward through the elements. When we get to the first aside, VO announces complementary. This is called a landmark role and assists in identifying page hierarchy. However, we can make this a bit more useful as a landmark by helping our H3 title be announced at the same time. To do this, we'll first add an ID attribute to each H3. An ID attribute can be added to any HTML element, but it must be unique on the page. It is a short name with no spaces, but dashes or underscores are allowed. So we can't add an ID with the value heading to each of these H3, but we can use a similar pattern such as aside-title-1 on the first and aside-title-2 on the second. With that in place, we'll add a new attribute to each aside called aria-labelledby. This is an attribute that takes another element's ID as its value and allows assistive tech like VO to associate the two. Let's add it and then see how it's handled by VO. On the first aside, add aria-labelledby with the value aside-title-1, and on the second one, add aria-labelledby with the value aside-title-2. Now when we use VO on the aside, the first one is announced, hobbies and interests, complementary, and the second is similar. This provides a better experience, particularly since we have included multiple aside elements. In addition, if we open the headings menu with VO plus U, and then use VO plus right arrow to navigate through the available rotor menus, the third one is for landmarks. You'll also see main is identified as a landmark. And we could optionally use the same technique on the main tag to associate it with our H2 as a label. If we had not used aria-labelledby, then there would be two items marked just as complementary, which is much less useful for informing the user of their content and purpose. There are many ways to use ARIA to help associate information for assistive technology. ARIA can help bridge the gap between your interface element and its intended purpose. Using the right HTML for the job, such as proper hierarchy, gets you a lot for free without having to add additional ARIA markup, and in turn helps ensure an accessible experience from the start. But knowledge of ARIA is useful for situations that are a bit more ambiguous. Review the resource links in the video description to learn more about ARIA. You can also use Inspector to review what's called the accessibility tree. Start by selecting an element to inspect, then switch to the Accessibility tab. This exposes the type of information assistive technology may use to communicate about your interface. If we inspect our Hobbies aside, we see the tag created by the aria-labelledby attribute, as well as the role complementary, which is provided directly by the accessibility tree due to the use of the aside element. The accessibility tree is useful to double-check to ensure content is available as intended throughout your interface. Another important aspect of accessibility for users who are sighted but have a visual impairment is ensuring appropriate contrast is met for text and interface elements. More examples can be found in our first lesson about accessibility, but let's review the text elements we have in this layout. Chrome Inspector has a built-in helper to check contrast. We'll select our H1 and then find where the color property is defined. Clicking on the color swatch icon opens Chrome's color picker, and midway down the panel is clearly stated contrast ratio 8.41 for our color of Rebecca Purple. This checker is taking into account the background color behind the text, which is currently white. It is showing two check marks to indicate that the contrast meets ratio requirements for both WCAG AA and AAA, where AAA is the more strict guidelines that require a ratio of 7:1, and AA requires 4.5:1 for text in general, or 3:1 for text larger than 18 pixels or 16 pixels and bold. If we grab the picker icon within the top part of the panel and drag it toward the lighter end, the contrast ratio updates in real time. Since the inspector also knows the size of the text, which is greater than 18 pixels, it doesn't start to fail the contrast until it falls below 3:1. You'll also notice it's actually changing the value of our text, which allows you to preview if the value is acceptable for your design. An additional feature is revealed by expanding the contrast ratio section. When expanded, lines appear overlaid on the color picker. Dragging the picker icon below the first line achieves minimum AA contrast, and dragging below the second line achieves at minimum AAA contrast. This is extremely useful if you are off by just a bit on your ratio to help you pick the closest option that passes for contrast. Let's check our H2. You can see this passes with a 3.11 contrast, which means it's acceptable for this large text, but would not be appropriate for paragraph text. Next, our paragraph text, which is inheriting from the color defined by the body rule, passes brilliantly with 5.14. When we inspect the link, we don't actually have the color value revealed in Inspector, due to how the user agent style sheet has defined it. But we can find the value by changing to the Computed tab, where we can copy the value, which is RGB 00238. Then back on the Styles tab, we'll use the element.style section provided at the top of Inspector, and add the color property with the value we just copied. Now we can open the color picker and see that the ratio is excellent at 9.40. It has been an unfortunate design trend to rely on color alone by removing the default underline from links, but this typically results in a failure of the accessibility success criteria. The criteria states that color alone should not be relied on to distinguish a link from surrounding text, unless the color of the link meets a 3:1 ratio with the surrounding text. The takeaway here is, don't remove underlines from links that are within paragraphs. You're passing accessibility for free by letting the browser apply the underline. In our capstone project, we will learn about additional tools to assess how our interface measures up against additional accessibility success criteria. Stay tuned for the next video, where we will style a blog layout. Be sure to subscribe. Support this project on Patreon. The link is in the video description.